The first time I read What Is to Be Done, in fact, I think I've only read What Is to Be Done once. But no, when I initially started trying to read it, I found it quite a difficult text to get into because it refers so directly to a lot of different.
We're live. I'm going to have to cut you off right now. Hello, everyone, in the live stream, and welcome to this sort of episode, I suppose, of the MSF Revolution series. First of all, introduce myself. I'm Jack from the Leeds Marxists, and I'm joined by Owen, who's also a member of Leeds Marxists. You get two for the price of one today. And today we're going to be, Owen's going to be leading a discussion on the Haitian Revolution. So first of all, I'll sort of talk about what the MSF is. The Marxist Student Federation is a grouping of Marxist societies across the country. I believe there are more than 30 now, everywhere from Leeds to Newcastle to London. So yeah, you should check out our social media, which is Marxist Student Federation on Facebook and Twitter, etc. We exist to spread the revolutionary ideas of Marxism, both on and off campus. And the Marxist Student Federation was set up by activists in the IMT, the International Marxist Tendency, which is, as the name suggests, an international revolutionary organization. So if you want to find out more about that, the British website for the IMT is Socialist Appeal. You can go there for the best Marxist news and analysis. And there's also Marxist.com as well, which is more sort of global affairs and stuff like that. And as I've mentioned, today's episode of the Revolution series is on the Haitian Revolution. And I believe that this is a sort of a time of history that's quite really overlooked in terms of like when you look at revolutionary histories. You know, it's overshadowed by the other sort of contemporary revolutions like the French Revolution. And it's something that admittedly I don't really know that much about. But I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm really looking forward to your lead off, Owen. So do you want to get started?
Absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to be trying something that I think is a little bit different for MSF streams. I'm going to be trying to do some visual aids via a PowerPoint presentation. So if you just bear with me a second, I'm going to try and share this screen right now. Can people see the PowerPoint here?
I can't see a PowerPoint.
Can you not?
No. We could just go without it, I suppose.
Here we are.
There we are. Excellent.
Excellent. Lovely. So is that working? And you can't see my Word document now.
We can see a screen like of the whole PowerPoint application.
But
we can still also see the PowerPoint as well. Now we can see the full PowerPoint.
Okay, lovely. So when Marxists discuss the epoch of bourgeois revolutions, the ones that we most commonly use as kind of archetypes or reference points for a bourgeois revolution, what it looks like and how it develops, are things like the English Revolution in the 1640s, the American Revolution in the 1770s, and most especially the French Revolution of 1789 to 93. But for a lot of the colonial world, the most important and instructive revolution of what's been called the Asian revolutions happened in what was then a French colony called Saint-Domingue, and it led to the establishment in 1804 of the modern Republic of Haiti. And there was a revolution of enslaved people of quite recent African descent for the most part, who succeeded in abolishing chattel slavery and soon after established the first independent Black republic on the planet. And this revolution was led by a uniquely talented and heroic and in many respects tragic individual in Toussaint L'Ouverture, whose name I think is as famous as the Haitian Revolution. It's inseparable from the Haitian Revolution. But it also produced a host of other notable characters in Dessalines, Henri Christophe, Dutty Boukman, and others. It struck the most decisive blow that against the transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery, which was still at that point the basis for the rising tide of industrial capitalism. It was an immense revolutionary shock to the world system. It demonstrated as well to Imperial Europe that these dark-skinned peoples that they'd previously always denigrated as ignorant and childlike could actually defeat them militarily and organize themselves politically according to the most modern principles, according to the same principles that were leading the revolution in France. And against the proclamations as well of a lot of Enlightenment philosophers such as Hegel, the Haitian revolutionaries demonstrated that African people were very much capable of making their own history, that they were as deserving of democratic rights as any Frenchman was. But the Haitian Revolution, like all these bourgeois revolutions, contained its own contradictions. It was the first successful conquest of state power by a revolution of a majority labouring class, in the sense that it was the enslaved people themselves that overthrew the French colonial state. But this didn't produce a move towards socialism of any kind. Socialism wasn't really on the minds of any of its leadership. Having been led by formerly enslaved people who were seeking to bring an end to their enslavement, the leaders of the revolution actually reinstituted a plantation system. And the state that's been established in Haiti since is in many ways a kind of basket case of colonized and post-colonial capitalism, where it's completely dominated by the competing interests of imperial powers and a craven ruling class. In Marxist terms, the revolution couldn't transcend its material circumstances, and so it couldn't permit the establishment of any kind of socialist regime. But even within the confines of that material necessity, the Haitian Revolution remains one of the most monumental social transformations in modern history. It's a key object of study for Marxists. It reveals so much about how capitalism and slavery are related, how racism and capitalism are related, about the dynamics between individual leaders and mass events. It's still one of the most important reference points, therefore, not just for revolutionaries in general, but particularly for the revolutionary struggle of the African diaspora. And it's an endless source of inspiration for revolutionaries who understand that the fight of abolitionists wasn't concluded when chattel slavery was abolished or when colonial government was replaced by the government of a new black ruling class. The struggle of the abolitionists in the 18th and 19th centuries continues today in the form of the struggle for socialism. And so this is very much a part of our tradition and our history, I think. So the classic account, and I think that not coincidentally, therefore, one of the classic account of the Haitian Revolution was itself written by a Trotskyist. It was written by C.L.R. James in 1938. In his book, The Black Jacobins, he begins with, I think, what is a brilliant opening kind of statement, where he says that Christopher Columbus landed first in the New World at the island of San Salvador, and after praising God, inquired urgently for gold. This is the basis on which European relations were established in the Americas, if you can call them relations. This is the beginning of the European conquest of the Americas. And from this island known as San Salvador, Columbus then was directed to a larger island nearby, known by its people as Haiti, but he called it Hispaniola. And there he was welcomed by this local population of Taino people who were excited to see him, and who he was excited to encounter, because he felt they'd be very, very easy to rob of resources and exploit for labor. And following Columbus's landing, that population were forced to convert to Christianity. They were buried in mines to extract metals that were valuable in European markets, in particular gold. And such was the violence and disease that was brought by these Europeans. In the 15 years after the arrival of Columbus, the population of Haiti, as it's called by the natives, by the locals, was reduced from up to 1 million to as low as 60,000 people. So it's a very rapid genocide, effectively. And for some of the Spaniards, this kind of pricked at the conscience and at the business savvy. It was inevitable that a labor shortage was on the horizon. So they resolved to start importing slave laborers from the coast of Africa. And this trade in enslaved Africans began as sort of a trickle, but through the 18th century, and I've got a graphic that I can demonstrate this with here. Beginning in the 18th century, through the 18th century, it became a tide of African people being forced over to the Americas, and one of the primary destinations for these enslaved Africans was this island of Hispaniola. The conditions that they were shipped over in are quite notorious. Is this sharing that screen now? Are people seeing that illustration?
I can't see it, I'm afraid.
That's unfortunate. I'll post this link in the event, and hopefully people can discover it for themselves. But it's an illustration of the kind of the patterns and the pace of the export of these enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. And as I say, Hispaniola was one of the primary destinations for enslaved Africans. The vast majority of them were sent to Brazil and the Caribbean, and not to North America, as a lot of people imagine, but a very significant portion were in Hispaniola. And early on in its colonization, the island was divided between the Spanish and the French parts. But the French part of the island in particular became one of the most important slave colonies in the Caribbean. The primary industry on the island was sugar, which required a very large and concentrated labor force. In a lot of ways, one of the things that some people say nowadays is that the sort of the origins of a lot of industrial techniques that you see in the industrial working class practice in the industrial working class, like Fordism and Taylorism, have their origins in slave labor and in the practices that are adopted in intensive industries like sugar. So it was primarily a sugar island, but increasingly too, it was dominated by slavery, having initially been balanced between kind of indentured labor from Europe and slavery. And through the 18th century, this French colony became the world's leading producer, not just of sugar, but also coffee. So two of the foundational commodities of the capitalist economy were being produced here. And the society the French built there was sharply divided, not just on class lines, but also in kind of complicated racial ways. So at the top of the social hierarchy, you had a white planter class who were what we call Creole. So they were culturally somewhat distinct from the Frenchmen. They were adapted to life in the colony. They dominated the economic infrastructure of the colony in the form, of course, of slave plantations. But they were contesting political power a bit with the French bourgeois, who were represented in the colonial bureaucracy. One of the main sort of sources of tension was around what they call the exclusive. So the exclusive right of the French to sell and buy goods from the colony. Below this class of white planters were kind of white petty bourgeois and the white poor, what's called the petit blanc. And these are kind of loyal Frenchmen who typically might have been managers or overseers of plantations or craftsmen in the towns. Alongside these, there were so-called colored people or mulattoes, who more correctly are called free people of color. And these were kind of mixed African and white ancestry. Often they were free, and quite often they were quite well-to-do. Some of them were even slave owners themselves. And so this was these were also a privileged and important part of the society in Saint-Domingue. And finally, and by far the most numerous group, were the African slave class. And throughout this period of the transatlantic slave trade, and despite the overwhelming difficulties of launching an effective resistance, struggle was a feature of life for these people. That is a class struggle, actually. It was often very difficult for Africans to communicate, as they spoke lots of different languages. They didn't share a common identity before they were enslaved. They weren't permitted to read or write. The mobility was very strictly controlled. Of course, they were brutalized routinely and all the rest of it. But resistance still was manifest, and it took a variety of forms. On one hand, you had fairly indirect forms of resistance to enslavement by maintaining African cultural beliefs and practices. They established networks that carried news and information across the Americas, and I think it's instructive for us revolutionaries today to understand the lengths to which enslaved African people went to ensure that they had their own independent sources of news and information for people who are trying to build a revolutionary media and our own infrastructure in the form of a newspaper today. But nevertheless, there are also far more direct and violent forms of resistance that occurred as well. Enslaved people launched mutinies on the slave ships. They fled the plantations to set up remote communities called Maroons. And so this was the kind of class struggle that developed in Saint-Domingue over the centuries. But the turning point for these enslaved people only came with the revolution in the metropole. So that is with the French Revolution, which broke out in 1789. In 1789, as I say, revolution exploded in France against the absolutist monarchy of the Bourbons. The ideals that were proclaimed by the revolution were those of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But among the many contradictions that were contained in that revolutionary movement was the fact that a lot of the members of the National Assembly, the Democratic Assembly created by the I might just stop sharing the screen because I don't think it's working. The Democratic Assembly created by the revolution and representative of the revolution, 15% of them were slave owners, or rather had their fortune made in the colonies, and in particular the colony of Saint-Domingue. And so according to C.L.R. James, the slave trade and slavery were the economic basis of the French Revolution. Radical elements in the French Revolutionary movement, including a group called the Amis de Noir, the Friends of the Blacks, as well as the philosopher Abbé Raynal, agitated against slavery, but this was a minority opinion from the start. So the ideas of the revolution very much appeared to contradict the reality of slavery, but the material motive force of the revolution was tied up completely with the slave trade and with slave plantations. But these ideas nevertheless made their way to the enslaved population in Saint-Domingue, and among those who came into contact with the French Revolution via the work of Abbé Raynal was a privileged and literate slave called Toussaint. He was called Breeder initially because of the name of his of the name of his owner. But for the white planters in Saint-Domingue as well, the rights of man that were proclaimed by the French Revolution had some significance. To the planters, it represented an opportunity to break away from France, to administer slavery as they liked, and to abolish France's exclusive rights to trade. But for the free people of color, again, the revolution had a different significance. The free people of color in Saint-Domingue, the revolution was an opportunity to win political enfranchisement and to abolish the racial discrimination that limited their abilities to advance in colonial society. So the French bourgeois knew that it was on the French bourgeois back in Paris knew that it was on this colonial question where the revolutionary principles would really be tested, and ultimately the colonial question debased these grand slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, because it confronted them with the reality of brute capital accumulation and the imperative of profit. Under the leadership of a triumvirate, a kind of moderate triumvirate of revolutionaries, Barnave, Lameth, and Duport, as well as under the influence of bourgeois organizations like the Massiac Club, and with revolution and counter-revolution continuing to sort of rage in France, the National Assembly kind of tried to sidestep the whole problem of the colonies, and in particular the problem of who they should extend the vote to in the colonies. Should they extend it regardless of property, in which case they would be enfranchising the poor whites? Should they extend it with property qualifications but without regard to race, in which case they'd be extending it to the propertied free people of colour? And in response to this kind of the vacillating of the National Assembly on this key question of who should get the vote, one free man of colour called Vincent Auger led a small insurrectionary effort in Saint-Domingue, which was brutally suppressed. Auger himself was tortured and executed. And the effect of this incident, having previously, the colonial question previously having been pushed back to the back of the agenda, this incident inflamed the passions of the enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, and it brought the colonial question to the fore, not just of the members of the assembly or of the colonial residents in Saint-Domingue, but to the fore of the minds of the masses in Paris. By 1791, the tide had turned decisively in favor of the revolutionary perspective. That is, the Assembly in Paris issued a declaration which enfranchised, admittedly a small, but nevertheless enfranchised a number of free people of colour, 400 people of colour in Saint-Domingue. In response, the planters in Saint-Domingue tried to claim effective independence. They also engaged in a campaign of terror against the free people of colour, and it launched the colony into what was effectively a civil conflict between two parts of its ruling class, effectively, or its ruling elite. Increasingly, the situation looked from France like a war between the whites on one hand, the white planters on the one hand, and the free people of colour on the other, with the free people of colour representing the loyal Frenchmen in this situation. So the French government landed soldiers at Saint-Domingue in order to reassert order. But from among these kind of conflicts among the privileged layers of Saint-Domingue society, there emerged a new revolutionary possibility, a far more radical possibility, which was a slave revolution from below. The enslaved population, as I've said, were taking note of revolutionary developments in France, and they certainly took note of the splits at the top of colonial society. And as political control was weakened, economic conditions were producing an intensification of the exploitation of the slaves, and the enslaved people began to organize a rebellion themselves. In the first instance, the rebellion was based in the north of the colony, and it was led by a man called Dutty Boukman, who was apparently a very big man. He was a high priest of voodoo, which was a survival of kind of African traditions that had been practiced by the enslaved people. And in a matter of days, such was the scale and success of the rebellion, the whole northern province of Saint-Domingue was under the control of the enslaved people, who fought ferociously and sought revenge effectively for their oppression. They destroyed vast amounts of property and they killed a lot of the whites. The success in the north was then mirrored in the south with quite similar results, and by 1792, a third of the island of Hispaniola was under the control of the slaves. But early on, the initial leader, Dutty Boukman, was killed and his head was displayed to intimidate his fellow revolutionaries. And so there became a bit of an opening, I suppose, at the top for leadership. And the man who ultimately came to replace Dutty Boukman was absent initially from the rebellion. He wasn't part of the initial rebellion. He was actually preoccupied with getting his master's family to safety. But the name of this man was Toussaint. I've mentioned him earlier. He adopted the name L'Ouverture, so his name was Toussaint L'Ouverture. He made his way to the rebel camp after helping this family of planters escape, and he quickly became a leading figure in the revolution. For one thing, the privileges he'd enjoyed very quickly promoted him in the ranks, as well as his natural kind of talent and intelligence. At 45 years of age, he was regarded as an old man by the people, by the slaves. But he became the outstanding figure of the revolution and one of the most accomplished men of his age. He's regarded as standing alongside Napoleon in his kind of stature. But this period of his period of enslavement, as I say, had been relatively privileged, which meant that he had key skills and knowledge that enabled him to play a prominent role. He had experience of administration. He had experience dealing with whites. He had something of an academic education. He'd read Caesar's commentaries. He'd read Abbe Raynal, this Enlightenment philosopher who had raged against slavery. And in Raynal in particular, Toussaint had read that the situation in the slave colonies was so unstable that it simply required, quote, a courageous chief to make a revolution. And Toussaint understood that he could be such a chief. His early role was a little bit more ambiguous, though. Having built up a force of several hundred dedicated followers, having picked a couple hundred of the best of the rebels, that is not simply amassing as big a force as he could, but ensuring that his force was effective and disciplined. Toussaint and the other leaders were invited to negotiations with the French, where they suggested that they could settle for it, where the leaders themselves, the slave leaders themselves, including Toussaint, said that they could settle for a peace in return for freedom for themselves and for the nearest followers, for 400 of the slaves. And so this was effectively a sellout, as it seemed with retrospect. And it's only really because of the intransigence of the French that Toussaint was convinced that peace wasn't possible. And that from that point forward, he set his sight firmly and uncompromisingly on complete liberty for all of the enslaved black people in Saint-Domingue. So having set his sights on this revolutionary goal, Toussaint continued to organize. He trained his soldiers to use the numbers to inflict the most damage on their enemies. And his ability in doing so distinguished him very quickly as not just a capable, as a military leader of brilliance. But even so, he suffered defeats against overwhelming odds. Luckily, he wasn't just a keen military mind, he was a key political mind. He understood the potential to exploit the imperialist rivalries that weakened the French. So as such, when the Spanish decided to launch an invasion of Saint-Domingue and they invited the black leaders of the rebellion to join them, Toussaint and the others agreed. But Toussaint in particular ensured that the leaders only brought the men into the Spanish army on the condition that Spain would fight against France with the promise of freedom to the black people. That is, they retained the revolutionary integrity of their struggle, and this revolutionary thrust remained paramount for them. As Toussaint's rebels fought with the Spanish, the radical French commissioners that had been sent to pacify the colony themselves tried to win favor with the black people. They themselves promised freedom to the slaves, but the French had exhausted any political capital they had with Toussaint for now, and the revolution was still the French Revolution was still dominated by bourgeois moderates, by Girondins, and so on, that really were vacillating and unreliable when it came to the issue of abolition. So Toussaint and the other leaders spurned the French appeals, and although it seems slightly contradictory or bizarre in retrospect, they fought for a time as royalists against the Republic. That is, royalists for the Spanish crown against the Republic. But the situation remained fluid, and the logic of history, the logic of the situation, would ultimately draw Toussaint back to the French revolutionaries. At the same time as Toussaint had and the revolution and the rebelling slaves had been won to the Spanish, the reactionary forces in Saint-Domingue were also looking for foreign allies. The white planters knew that the ultimate betrayal of France, the ultimate way to ensure one of the ultimate kind of ways to ensure that they could retain their slave plantations, would be to ally with Britain. So as such, they cultivated an alliance with the British that the Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt, was only happy to accept. So British forces were sent from Jamaica into Saint-Domingue. And if Britain had managed to gain control of the colony, which, if we remember, was one of the most profitable colonies on the planet, the global balance of forces at this incredibly significant and unstable time would have been decisively shifted. Not only would it have given a massive economic boost to Britain, it would have been a new foothold for them in the Americas, and it would have turned the British Empire from an empire of abolition into an empire of slavers. Of course, as we know, the empire became eventually passed abolition as a law. So the entry of Britain into the equation again shifted the balance of forces. As I say, the Spanish now looked to ally with the British against the French, and this meant that they effectively abandoned their commitment to abolition. And so Toussaint looked to break from them with his growing military force. He looked to break from the Spanish, and I think once again we see the kind of the treachery of the imperialists and the difficulty, in fact, the impossibility of maintaining a sort of principled alliance with people from a post-class perspective. And it's only with the new forward impetus of the revolution in France that Toussaint found a way forward, though. Initially, he was kind of stuck on the side of the Spanish, watching their allies, the British, inflict defeats on the French with a view to restoring slavery. But the impetus given by the revolution in France in 1792-93, the replacement in particular of Brissot and the Girondins by Robespierre and the Jacobins, this massive swing to the left in France, ended the long period of indecision and unreliability on the question of abolition, and it gave way to a clear policy of opposition to slavery on the part of the French Republic. Once Toussaint heard the news that the Jacobins had declared an end to slavery, he immediately broke from Spain and he joined the French commissioner Sonthonax, who previously had tried to win him over with claims that he would abolish slavery. And Toussaint's affiliation with Republican France turned the tide on the island of Hispaniola, while the decree of liberty for enslaved people fired the masses to ensure the British and French and Spanish were defeated. Toussaint really took the initiative and pushed the revolution to its conclusion effectively. So we see that the progress of the revolutions in France and Haiti were bound together. At the high point of these revolutions, the masses had an interest in their mutual liberation, and it was the revolutionary upsurge in Haiti helped to radicalize the French Revolution by pushing this colonial question to the fore of the agenda, to the front of the agenda. And equally, the upsurge of the masses in Paris and the rise of the Jacobins and this swing to the left in Paris, in France, opened the way for Toussaint and the enslaved people to win their freedom. So this alliance with revolutionary France really made Toussaint into the revolutionary leader that he became. He established himself as the most effective, the most important and the most powerful leader on the island. And by 1796, he'd become the inspiration for the black troops. He'd committed black people to Republican ideals of liberty and so on. And he'd led the reorganization of the economy too, so that agricultural production could be resumed. And that is effectively, he restored the economy not on a slave basis, but he maintained the plantation economy more or less unchanged. But relations between Toussaint and the French government soured as he carried the revolution forward in Saint-Domingue, and the revolution in France at the same time was being rolled back. The destruction of the Jacobin government in 1794 led to a directorate which put the maritime bourgeois and the planters, that is the forces most hostile to abolition, back in the driving seat, at least in part. And Toussaint knew that this put the question of slavery back on the agenda. At the same time, Toussaint's kind of politicking gave rise to suspicion in France that he desired to make Saint-Domingue into an independent state. He defeated a series of individual rivals in a series of kind of political encounters and rebellions. He defeated Sonthonax, this French representative and radical. He defeated a rebellious free man of color called Rigaud. He defeated a French governor called de Douville. And finally, in 1801, Toussaint declared himself governor for life because he understood the direction of travel of the French policy, which was toward the restoration of slavery. So from being a demand that had been raised by planters against a possible slave revolution, the demand of independence became the central demand of the Haitian Revolution to defend and protect the liberty of the freed blacks. So by this point, the revolution in France was well and truly crushed under Napoleon's boot. The living tradition of Jacobinism died in 1797 with the utopian communist Babeuf, and Napoleon issued an expeditionary force to Haiti to restore slavery to the colony. And this began the Haitian War of Independence, which was a war to preserve the liberty of the black population, and at the same time was a struggle of national liberation. The first, one of the first, I think, modern struggles of national liberation that you can really talk about. Toussaint instructed his generals, including Henri Christophe and the brutal Dessalines, both of whom have gained their own kind of reputations in history. He instructed them to wage a merciless war. He said to them, "Leave nothing white behind you." So the policy adopted on the part of the Haitians was the scorched earth policy, which sought to deprive the French of any food or sustenance, but also meant that when they captured any whites, men, women, and children, they were massacred. And this extreme violence has been used by some historians to obscure the noble, the revolutionary, the progressive content of this struggle, and its brilliance actually. The Haitian people were as brutal as they were determined, and the brutality was precisely an expression of the determination to remain free. And they were inspired as well when the French and they were inspired and inspirational to this army that claimed the French army that claimed to be representing the tradition of the revolution. For example, when the French army were bombarding one Haitian fortress, the Haitians sang songs of the French Revolution, which was effective in demoralizing the French soldiers. So this is the kind of psychological warfare that we see time and again waged by revolutionary armies ever since, not least, of course, in the 20th century in the fight against fascism. As a result, in part because of Toussaint and Christophe's leadership and Dessalines' leadership, but more particularly as a result of the revolutionary elan of the masses and a wave of disease amongst French soldiers as well, the Haitians won a series of victories. But in 1802, Henri Christophe defected to the French and the tide seemed to turn. It was symptomatic, or this defection of Christophe, as well as some of the mistakes in the leadership of Toussaint, was symptomatic of the wavering and the growing weakness of the leadership of the revolution. Toussaint, Christophe, and Dessalines, after this defection, ultimately accepted positions in the French army and agreed to integrate their forces with the French on condition that there would be no return to slavery. This was, in many respects, you might call it naive, but it was certainly a misjudgment of the French. And it was also a misjudgment of the mood of the Haitian masses and a betrayal of the Haitian masses, who continued to wage a guerrilla struggle even after the leaders had exhausted themselves and had decided to go and join the French. Toussaint almost inevitably, I think, was betrayed. He was shipped to France. He was captured, shipped to France, and he died in prison there. And so that closed the chapter of Toussaint's leadership of the revolution. But the struggle revived soon afterwards. The French commanders and their army had been laid low by yellow fever, so they were demoralized and weak. And Napoleon then sought to restore slavery quite openly with these new codes. So the rebellion restarted. The guerrilla resistance really hadn't properly stopped, but Christophe and Dessalines defected again from the French and took the leadership once again. And the new campaign that was launched was even more brutal than before. The new campaign of the war was even more brutal than before. The French waged effectively a genocidal war against the Haitian people. And Dessalines matched their executions with his own. And finally, after several years of this warfare and France warring at the same time with Britain, the Haitians were able to win their independence. And so on the 1st of January 1804, Dessalines declared the Republic of Haiti at the city of Gonaïves. War continued. Effectively, struggles continued in Haitian society, though. Dessalines massacred the counter-revolutionary whites that remained on the island, although I think it's worth noting that it was only the counter-revolutionary whites. Individual whites that had sided with the Haitians were not considered white anymore. They were considered black, and so they were spared. And the free people of color, or mulattoes as they were called at the time, continued to rebel against black leadership. And so the establishment of the Free Republic of Haiti was certainly not the end of a very intense political struggle on the island. And in many cases, the Haitian Republic since has been a case study in the politics and economics of imperialist domination. While the revolution laid a blueprint for anti-colonial struggle for the following centuries, and it kick-started revolutionary abolitionism in the 19th century, its outcome is also, as I say, a kind of a case study of what happens when you carry out an anti-colonial revolution, but you're not able to actually abolish the imperialist system, which initially produced the subordination of that nation. And so, since what you've seen is Haitian capitalism that's crippled by debt, that's subordinate to the whim and in particular the military impositions of imperialists. It was occupied by America in the early 20th century, and every upsurge of the Haitian masses is responded to with brutality by the ruling class and with decisive counter-revolutionary action, by the forces of international imperialism, not just in the form of the United States, but also in the form of the United Nations and other so-called kind of pacifist and internationalist organizations. So Haitian capitalism is a decrepit system, and this is the system this is the only kind of system which the revolution could ultimately produce for the Haitian masses. But the revolutionary elan of the Haitian masses, their will to fight, remains, I think, undimmed. And even in the past year, you've seen a new revolutionary upturn in Haiti, effectively an insurrectionary situation where the masses were on the street for weeks on end, and threatening the government with overthrow. And what's missing here, of course, is any kind of revolutionary leadership of an equivalent, if you like, to the role that Toussaint and Henri Christophe and Dessalines played in previous generations. But also, I think what's necessary, I think when we're talking in Britain now about Haiti, and the question, of course, is thinking about Haitian history and the present situation in Haiti. Well, what can we do about it? Actually, I think one of the major lessons of the Haitian Revolution is precisely that the fate of that revolution and the fate of that nation is completely tied up with the development of the revolutionary forces at the center of the imperialist system in places like France, but also in Britain. And so one of the lessons, I think, as well from the Haitian Revolution and the subsequent development of Haiti is the urgent requirement, the most pressing requirement actually for the anti-colonial revolution and for the revolution in places like Haiti, is the development of the subjective facts, the development of a revolutionary organization, a revolutionary consciousness in the biggest imperialist powers on the planet, which are the powers, after all, that time and again have strangled revolutions of this kind. And it's actually is with a new impetus of revolution in major imperialist countries. The way will be very much open. In fact, the way will be free for the Haitian masses to remake their own history again, and to really deliver on the promise of the Haitian Revolution, which, after all, is a promise that we take up ourselves of liberty, equality, fraternity. We understand, of course, that promise needs to be filled with a socialist content, and that's our task as Marxists today, as students of the Haitian Revolution and as inheritors of its revolutionary tradition.
Thank you very much for that, Owen. That was an excellent lead off to the discussion. I really enjoyed it. It was very well researched. Yeah, I like the conclusions that you made as well towards the end about the sort of the importance of the international dimension of the revolution. I found it really interesting, particularly to see how the events of the French Revolution sort of tied in and influenced the development of the Haitian Revolution as well. I'd just like to remind everyone in the webinar that if you'd like to make a contribution, to raise your hand. There should be a button out here to make a contribution, or if not, then you can submit a question through the Q&A feature. And also, if you're in the live stream as well, you can ask a question in the live stream as well, and that will get to me eventually. So we're going to start off with some contributions. We've got a contribution here from Olivia. I'm going to bring her into the webinar. Hi, Olivia.
Hiya. Hi, everyone. Yeah, that was a really great lead off, like covering sort of obviously like the main events of like the Haitian Revolution. I'm not going to speak any further on the revolution itself, but I kind of wanted to come in on what you touched on right at the end, actually, which is kind of that continuing role of imperialism and things like that. And obviously the main lesson being that, particularly for sort of countries that were colonized by, you know, like European and the US and things like that, like they're like, it's inextricably has to be tied up with that struggle for socialism as well. And I think Haiti is a perfect example of that, especially when you consider it, you know, its neighbor, Cuba. Obviously, we talked about Cuba last week, and I think these two, you can draw a lot of parallels and things like that. So yeah, I think the ruling class, like, were very burnt by the experience of Haiti, like to have ex-colonial subjects sort of rise up against like the imperialist power. Particularly, obviously, there's like a racial element to it as well. Like they didn't consider these people human, and now they were like, you know, taking matters and power into their own hands. And I think big part of this is like that continuing influence of imperialism, is that they want to continue to make Haiti pay, even though it's been hundreds of years since the revolution. You know, they're still subject to pay, you know, reparations to France and things like that. And obviously they're also subject to US capital, and you know, it's kind of like Cuba before its revolution. It's kind of like you've got all these multinationals who kind of run the show and things like that. And I think one thing that is lost about Haiti as well, that the only thing I ever knew about Haiti was what I learned at school in geography because of the 2010 earthquake. And kind of what we were always told was like, oh, they're so poor, they were so unprepared for this earthquake. And then when I was actually reading about, you know, Haiti when I came to university, because I actually got set an essay on CLR James, so it meant I got to go read the Black Jacobins and things like that. Like, you know, Haiti's history since the revolution has just been invasion, a coup, natural disasters. Like, natural disasters aren't necessarily preventable in and of themselves, but the way they're dealt with is very much because of the way their economy functions and the fact that people living in Haiti have no power over their political system or economic system. And, you know, they're exposed every day to the horrors of international capital. And it remains the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere as a result. You know, one thing that is quite sensationalized, but unfortunately true about Haiti is obviously like the levels of hunger, like people have to eat mud, like, and things like that. And it's completely ridiculous, which is absolutely crazy. They have to import food from America, like obviously at high rates and things like that. And yeah, essentially throughout like the 80s and 90s and the 70s, 80s and 90s, they were subject to like multiple CIA coups and things like that. They'd elect someone and then there'd be a coup like a few months later. And there was actually there's been a couple of general strikes in Haiti as well, but like you say, they get sort of brutally put down. And obviously that's what we need to acknowledge, is that the working class of Haiti, they're not passive victims. Like, they understand what's being done to them, but like you say, it lacks the necessary leadership to take the demands of the working class further and things like that, and join up with, you know, the rest of Latin America, or the working class of Latin America, I should say. And obviously Haiti is still subject to, you know, IMF package and austerity. You know, they were hit hard by the AIDS crisis and they actually still are suffering the repercussions of that today. You know, they have to deal with the assassination of their political leaders. And, you know, it's not so much obviously the US having an influence now, it's the UN, you know, that UN that we're told is apolitical in the interest of human rights. But essentially these UN troops are essentially as bad as the US troops. And things like that. And essentially Haiti is just a means for America to exploit really cheap labor. And obviously people in Haiti cross the border to work and things like that. So they're subject to, like, you know, violence in that way as well. So yeah, just like I wanted to say, like, the class struggle in Haiti, inspired by obviously their own revolution, it still continues to this day. There's protests, there's riots, there's strikes pretty much every couple of months if you keep up with it. But now obviously what is needed is a conscious revolutionary element that's able to, you know, that's capable of taking power off the US basically. And obviously that will only come, it can't just be in Haiti alone, it will have to be revolution spreading across Latin America into America and the rest of the world. So that they're no longer subject to the forces of international capital. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Olivia. I'm going to remove you from the webinar now. I'll see you. Yeah, I completely agree with Olivia's point about the sort of international nature of the question of revolution. I also think that, like, one of the parallels that can be made between like relatively modern Haitian history and the Haitian Revolution is that the idea that you can't compromise with imperial aggressors. And I know that Toussaint L'Ouverture quite skillfully at the start sort of managed to maneuver between imperial powers, but then towards the end really sort of had to learn the lesson the hard way, that you can't compromise. You can't sort of make bargains with imperial powers. and there's a figure in modern Haitian history, or at least like modern Haitian politics, called Aristide, who was a reformist who came around in the 90s, I think. He sort of came to power on a sort of reformist program of extending like what the welfare state and education services and stuff. But very quickly was forced into compromise with the US and the IMF, to take structural readjustment and stuff like that. I think that's another sort of key parallel that we can make. But I'm not going to rant on. I don't want to abuse my position as chair. Have you had a chance to look at the Q&As, Owen?
I have a little bit, yeah.
Do you want me to bring in some more contributions to give you a time?
You want me to pick through some of these questions?
I was going to ask you, want me to bring in some more contributors so you have a chance to sort of look through the questions?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Right,
give me a little bit more chance to speak.
I'm going to bring in Keelan now to make a contribution. Hi, Keelan.
Hello.
How's it going?
Fantastic lead off. One really enjoyed that. So thanks for that.
I like your flag.
Cheers. Yeah, it's a bit sort of collapsing there, but yeah, I want to make a brief point about like internationalism, or sort of like the international aspect of revolutions, and I think that's one of the key lessons from the Haitian Revolution is how revolutions spread. And I think it's important because people often question Marxists when we assert the necessity for like a world revolution, right? They sort of view it as fanciful, right? They claim that that's just an absurd suggestion or an idea. But like even in the 1790s, we saw this as a phenomena of the revolution spreading, because you have this revolutionary impulse from France serving to sort of set Haiti alight, as sort of the slaves enter this heroic struggle. And then, but it's also a dialectical process, as you sort of mentioned, because the Haitian Revolution serves to radicalize the revolution in France, so that by 1793 slavery is abolished in the French Empire. And then, and then you have a process in which the sort of Thermidorian reaction and acts as a sort of whip hand of counter-revolution, which radicalizes the revolution in Haiti, because as with Napoleon's attempts to reimpose slavery in Haiti and all the rest of it, you sort of get this radicalization of the revolution there, where the revolution becomes about forming an independent nation state. So this sort of internationalism is a real kind of inspiration, right? The fact that you have this exchange of ideas and revolutionary ferment, and that was possible in the 1790s, when it took weeks for information to transcend the Atlantic. I think it's incredibly inspiring, especially for us today, because now, with information being shared instantly from across the world, like the potential and scope for revolution spreading is all the greater now than it even was in the 1790s. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Keelan. I'm going to remove you from the webinar now. See you.
Just picking up just very quickly on that. I think it relates to one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A. I think, so is it Nick said, what effect did the Haitian Revolution have on other slave populations at the time, and what are the slave uprisings, whether in Latin America or the US? I'm not gonna lie, I don't know enough about Latin American slave rebellions to talk in it with much confidence about it. But for example, I think one of the other ways in which this revolution manifested itself internationally and was a revolution of international significance, and I think an example actually of how revolutions can't be contained by nation states is actually this question of the way that news about the Haitian Revolution spread among slave populations across the Caribbean and North America, certainly. And this was, of course, against the will of the ruling class and the planter class, who very much tried to keep the enslaved people, the slaves, in ignorance. And so they had this, and so the slaves that were able to move around, and the free people that were participating in the abolition movement, spread word that Haitians had managed to overthrow slavery in this revolutionary upsurge, and it had a direct impact on slave rebellions in other sort of islands like Martinique and Guadeloupe, I think, but also in North America. So obviously, one of the most of the significant slave rebellions that happened in the United States before the Civil War were a direct response to the Haitian Revolution. So for example, if you think about Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 is one of the most famous, but also Denmark BC and others. These people were very often aware of the Haitian Revolution, might have heard of Haiti, and for centuries afterwards, still Haiti was a reference point for Black revolutionaries who were trying to, rebel or imagine life, rebel against racism, rebel against imperialism, and were often affiliated with socialist ideas. And so, yeah, it's had massive ramifications through time, but it also had very direct ramifications in terms of the revolutionary struggle for abolition across the Americas.
Mm-hmm. And I also understand as well that that the events in the Haitian Revolution, especially the sort of the violence on the behalf of the revolutionaries, was used as a sort of to fearmonger on the behalf of like the plantation owners in America, in the US, in order to gain support from poor white workers against the cause of abolition. Is that right? Or
yeah, so I mean, the violence of the Haitian Revolution is something that has been given, I think, a lot of perhaps outsized attention, and it shook the fear of God into the planters. But yeah, it's also insofar as people were able to frame it as racial violence and just a war of the blacks against the whites, it becomes completely a tool for racial domination. And for the domination of the poor whites, the ideological enslavement effectively of the poor whites to this idea of racial division. But yeah,
I'm just gonna cut you off there and bring in some more contributions, because we've got a few people with their hands up right now, and then we can go back to some more of the questions in the Q&A section. So I'm going to bring in Ruben now. Hi, Ruben, another lead Marxist, temporarily.
Yeah, that was a great lead off. Thank you. Yeah, I just I think that the Haitian Revolution raises some interesting questions for Marxists over the use of violence. So I'd just like to add a bit on the Marxist view of force and revolution. So I'll start by saying that the Marxists are entirely in favor of peaceful revolution. But it's also true that the Marxists are not pacifists. And we recognize that in attempting to transform society by putting the wealth of society under public and democratic control, history teaches us that revolutionaries will possibly be met with violent resistance of the old ruling class, who will inevitably attempt to defend their privileges. However, Marx and Engels rejected conspiracies of individuals like acts of terrorism, etc., instead insisting that mass action was the correct strategy. So in 1865, writing to Engels on an act of terrorism by Irish independence fighters, Marx argued that terrorism has driven the masses into the arms of the government parties. And he writes that one cannot expect the London proletarians to allow themselves to be blown up in honor of their Fenian emissaries. There's always a kind of fatality about such secret melodramatic sorts of conspiracies. And then Lenin builds on this and sharply critiques the methods of the social revolutionaries who substituted terrorism for mass work in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. For Lenin, terrorism reflected an utter failure to understand the mass movement and a lack of faith in it. He says that terrorism reveals an inefficacy of the inefficacy of terrorism reveals that without the working class, all bombs are powerless. Yet Trotsky also makes a similar point and eschews this kind of terrorist violence, but he rightly doesn't reject violence as a whole and calls for the armed insurrection and the conquest of state power by the working class. The workers' movement shouldn't shun the oppressed masses for their desire for revenge. Rather, this anger should be directed into a collective struggle against the system. That is in the direction with the most burning desire for revenge can find its highest moral satisfaction, essentially in revolution. For Trotsky, the revolution must not involve any kind of individual violence because it's ineffective, but only collective harness violence in the form of class struggle. And to end, I'll paraphrase Lenin that revolutionaries must defend the cause of the working class by deed as well as words. And I think that might shine some light onto what we think about terrorism. Violence in the context of the Haitian Revolution. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Ruben.
Cheers.
I'm gonna remove you from the panel. Yeah, I agree with Ruben's point. Definitely, I think we should have a view of violence that sort of stipulates that there is such thing as progressive violence and reactionary violence. And I think the example of violence that was used in the Haitian Revolution was without doubt progressive. One question that we've got in the Facebook stream is asking, have you got any text recommendations on the Haitian Revolution? I know that you've mentioned the Black Jacobins, but is there anything else that you'd like to recommend?
I have a bunch of suggestions. So I mean, the Black Jacobins. Everybody should read the Black Jacobins. It's one of the best Marxist texts ever written, and just reviewing it for this lead off has been a joy, to be honest. So I mean, you have to read the Black Jacobins. But other than that, there's a more recent kind of modern historian has written a history of the Haitian Revolution called Avengers of the New World. I think his name is Laurent Dubois. There's books like The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery by The Overthrow of Colonial Slavery by Robin Blackburn covers the Haitian Revolution. It's particularly good in terms of looking at the Haitian Revolution in relation to the French Revolution and developments in France. You've got a book like The Common Wind, which is about it's only been published fairly recently, even though it's written in the 80s, which is sort of about the dynamic, the international implications of the Haitian Revolution, and in particular about those networks of sort of news and information amongst Black people in the Americas. So how news about the Haitian Revolution was carried to different areas. There's a good biography of Toussaint L'Ouverture by Christian Hogsbjerg, who's a Marxist, and another guy whose name I can't remember. I think it's just called Toussaint L'Ouverture, a political biography. They're the books that spring to mind right now. But yeah, there's a lot of good material.
Mm-hmm.
But the first, last, and foremost book is the Black Jacobins, to be honest.
Yeah, I'll definitely have to add that to my my coronavirus reading pile. So we've got another question here in the Q&A section, asking why is Toussaint L'Ouverture often described as the Black Napoleon, and what is the significance of this comparison?
So I mean, there are a few things. I mean, one is obviously that Napoleon is regarded as the kind of the great man of history, sort of the ultimate great man of history, who transformed the world at precisely the same time as the Haitian Revolution was going on. Of course, he's responsible for Toussaint's death, effectively, and so as a kind of the archetypal hero of the modern, like an archetypal kind of hero of the modern world, Toussaint is kind of the counterpart to that. To the role that Napoleon played, and there, in some respects, there are kind of similarities in that both of them were in some. I mean, I'm not sure. In some senses, Napoleon was a revolutionary. In a lot of senses, he was also a counter-revolutionary. But they both were part of were major figures in the age of revolutions, who were extremely dynamic men of action, who were extremely effective military leaders, as well as being very astute political figures. Yeah, the kind of mix of like intellectual influences and their abilities as sort of leaders and men of action are kind of comparable. I think in terms of and the stature in history is comparable. I think in terms of the actual roles they played, though, they're very different figures. Napoleon came sort of at the end during a lull in the French Revolutionary movement. And he effectively sort of he represented the end point effectively of the revolutionary upsurge of the 1780s. Whereas Toussaint was a dynamic leader of the revolution. Toussaint was almost a Robespierre and a Napoleon wrapped into one, if you like. So the roles that they played were very, very different, but the stature is kind of similar. And also, I suppose, for a lot of African Americans studying history as well, Black people studying history as well, it's also about establishing their own kind of heroes and their own kind of tradition of historical figures to sort of emulate and look up to and admire. And so one of the significances of Toussaint has been as a figure that in the building of kind of Black history, that Black people have been able to build up as an exemplary figure of kind of Black excellence and achievement and revolutionary advance, if you like,
Mm-hmm.
and greatness.
Yeah. I'm now gonna bring in another contribution from Lewis. Hi, Lewis.
Yeah, how's it going?
Hey, Lewis.
Yeah, really enjoyed the lead off. I think the Haitian Revolution really is a good opportunity, especially with Toussaint, to like explain the Marxist understanding of the individual in history. Because it's often said that like Marxists are like economic determinists with no consideration for individuals. You know, it must be said that like Marx and Marxists have never denied the importance of, you know, human agency, especially that of like individual leaders. Individual leaders, which, you know, can have a very profound and sometimes vital role, has been showed, like, you know, throughout this lead off, in the course of human history. You know, we often say that without Lenin or Trotsky, you know, the October Revolution would likely have failed. What Marxists argue against, you know, is this bourgeois notion of history, which sort of views like revolutionary periods where, you know, the masses are like passive recipients of charismatic, dedicated, and resolute leaders. You know, this sort of great man theory of history. And, you know, while Toussaint was certainly an intelligent and courageous leader, you know, you mentioned his educated background, which was obviously necessary for his leadership. Ultimately, it was still a product of his era. You know, he didn't emerge with these qualities in a vacuum. The emergence of, like, you know, these particular great leaders like Toussaint is ultimately accidental, you know, in that, you know, had Toussaint not been around, you know, had he, like, I don't know, died of tuberculosis or something, or had his masters convinced him not to return to Saint-Domingue, then some other leader likely would have filled that role, possibly not as effective as or skilled as Toussaint, but nonetheless, ultimately that vacuum would have been filled. I think what matters is that, you know, this accident is expressed through necessity. In these revolutionary periods, you know, the demands and needs of society, especially in these revolutionary periods, you know, the masses call forward these individuals with certain traits and certain qualities, which, you know, Toussaint certainly fulfilled. I just wanted to remember that.
All right, thanks very much for your contribution, Lewis.
Cheers.
I'm gonna remove you from the stream. Yeah, I completely agree with Lewis's point there, especially around the idea that bourgeois historians sort of fixate quite a lot on the sort of personal, on the personal qualities of certain leaders. And although obviously those do play a role, I think another thing that we've got to look at as well is that is not just the courage of these sort of great men, but also like the sort of courage and determination that is the courage and determination of the masses themselves, who are driving force of any revolutionary process. I think you see that in the fact that despite you know, the Haitian masses being you know, much more impoverished than their French counterparts, the fact that they had the sort of their determination for national liberation on their side, as opposed to the sort of French soldiers who were fighting for a cause that fundamentally, you know, wasn't in their interests, sort of puts it into perspective how it's really the masses who determine the outcome of history.
And I think even if you think about individual greatness, like Toussaint was obviously an exceptional figure and an exceptional leader, with a particular set of skills and so on. But like at the very end of the revolution, when the Haitian masses were striving for independence, and Toussaint was essentially vacillating, and ultimately went over to the side of the French, and that led to his death. The masses are still, the sacrifices the masses were making were absolutely extraordinary. There's an anecdote, I think, in Black Jacobins, where James talks about three Haitians who, in the midst of the final campaign, were being executed by being burned alive, and one of them was a 19-year-old boy, and the first two were burned, and obviously they responded how you'd expect. They screamed, and having heard his two compatriots being set alight, this boy said, you shouted at them, "You don't know how to die." He sat down, and as he was set on fire, he just sort of sat in silence, and he died in silence, had been burned alive. And I mean that kind of that takes a kind of bravery, a boldness, and just an extraordinary level of kind of spirit of sacrifice and commitment. And that was the kind of spirit that animated the whole Haitian people at this point, which was actually Toussaint's lowest point. And this is the spirit that won the revolution. And however skilled and brilliant and glamorous Toussaint was, those are the sacrifices and the realities of that won the Haitian Revolution. Yeah.
So I believe that was the last of the contributions to be made, but we have got a few questions here in the Q&A. Have you had a chance to look through those, Owen?
Yeah, so I've got a few things I can say about a few of the questions. So I think I've covered the thing about Black Napoleon. One thing that's cropped up a couple of times, there's a few questions about sort of post-independence Haiti that I can elaborate on a little bit. So I think a couple of people have talked about the role of debt and also the role of the UN in Haiti since. So I think it's quite notoriously after the revolution, after independence rather, Haiti was saddled with debt. The French forced Haiti to pay compensation, effectively a vast amount of compensation for having stolen, in inverted commas, stolen their possessions in the form of the slaves. And so from the very beginning of its independence, Haiti was saddled with a massive debt burden, which effectively crippled its attempts to develop itself over a century. It wasn't able to pay off these independence debts, which of course accumulated interest. It wasn't able to pay off these debts until I think 1947, certainly until the 1940s. So it took 140 years, more than 140 years for them to pay off these debts. That's 140 years of lost development, effectively, for this nation. And I think at this point it's worth comparing it with Cuba, actually. So yeah, it was saddled with debt. Having paid off that debt, not too long afterwards, it was crippled by counter-revolutionary dictators, U.S. clients, effectively the Duvaliers, Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvalier, who saddled it once again, the country once again with loads of debt, which again it struggles to pay off, because at the end of the day, these debt burdens and their inability to pay the debt is simply a reflection of their position in the global economy. For the British economy, we're able to accumulate vast quantities of debt because there's faith that we'll pay it back, and there's a stability in the economy, and we're a dynamic force in the global economy. There's no material basis for these repayments, and these debts have no progressive role or productive role in the Haitian economy. The whole role of imperialism has been as a leech on the Haitian people and on the Haitian economy. And related to that, I think, is the role that so-called aid organizations and international organizations have played time and again when the Haitian masses have risen up once again to reassert their independence, and more specifically, actually, more than assert their independence, to win for themselves new social demands and social gains by electing figures like Aristide time and again. The imperialists, in particular the US and France, have intervened to stop them, have intervened to replace these elected sort of progressive leaders with right-wing dictators and other kinds of coup government. And they've actually found accomplices in this, in aid organizations, in particular within the UN. So since 2004, when Aristide was last overthrown, I think, that is Aristide, who was a progressive elected politician, was overthrown by the US. The UN instituted a regime, the UN Mission for the Stabilization of Haiti, which effectively meant that the UN started to act as a police force for the coup government, and acted to prevent the self-organization and the political organizing of the Haitian masses to improve the law. If I remember correctly, I think the UN regime has even gone so far as to shoot at striking workers in Haiti in order to maintain this so-called stabilization process. And so the role of these do-gooding organizations plays certainly doesn't do any good at all. The only people it does any good for are the international imperialists and the profit seekers. And so yeah, in a certain sense, one of the tragedies of Haitian history since then has been that, having proclaimed independence, it wasn't able to. It was prevented from developing itself by the same forces of international imperialism that it had previously defeated so decisively and heroically. Another question that I'd like to expand on a little bit, pick up on, is the relation between the Haitian revolutionaries and the Jacobins. Obviously, we call the Haitian Revolution has picked up the revolutionists have picked up this nickname, the Black Jacobins, and in a lot of senses, it's a very apt description. The Jacobins, as I say, were the far left of the French Revolution. They were the most consistent Democrats of the French Revolution. In a lot of respects, the Haitian Revolutionaries outflanked them to the left. Prominent Jacobins like Robespierre weren't particularly dedicated actually to the abolition of slavery, although they did support the decision. There was more practical politics and realpolitik behind it. There was as much practical and realpolitik behind it as there was principle. But there were, the actual relationship between the Haitian Revolutionaries and the Jacobin Club and those individuals is pretty minimal, from what I understand. The Haitian Revolutionaries had very little opportunity to build direct links with the Jacobin Club and with leading figures of the French Revolution. So, I mean, if we just think about the timeline, the war for abolition was still going on 1793-94. After 1794, when the Jacobins were defeated, and Toussaint, from what I understand, never visited France until he was deported there by Napoleon. The most direct manifestation of kind of Jacobinism in Haiti that had an impact on the revolution were individuals like Sonthonax, so colonial commissioners that were sent by the revolutionary regime who were genuine and committed revolutionaries. And Sonthonax, in particular, I think actually played quite a noble role. He was distinguished in the minds of the black slave, the enslaved people, as one of the few whites who were actually fighting for black rights, even during the period of sort of Toussaint's government. When Toussaint and Sonthonax became rivals, Sonthonax was very highly regarded universally, actually, and he was a very consistent defender of abolition and of the ideals of the revolution. In fact, when I talked a little bit about during the war for abolition, the French had claimed that they were going to abolish slavery. It was Sonthonax that took that initiative. The difficulty was that the National Assembly back in Paris hadn't actually ratified that, but the colonial commissioners themselves, well, at least one of these colonial commissioners, was very much in favour of abolishing slavery. And so I suppose the most direct connection you can identify between the Black Jacobins and the actual Jacobin Club is through these commissioners and individuals that were sent from France, who did sometimes play a very genuine and progressive role, but not so much direct connections between figures like Toussaint and Robespierre. Mara.
Right. So it's currently 7:15. I reckon we might have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions before we sum up. One question that I think you might have already covered a little bit, but it might be worth going over again, is someone has asked, what was the impact on consciousness for other oppressed people in the Americas? And I guess also just like in a global sense as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I suppose I covered a little bit some of the impacts that it had on the enslaved populations in places like other Caribbean islands like Cuba, Guadeloupe, Martinique, as well as on the enslaved people in the Americas. It had a very direct impact in terms of provoking kind of major slave rebellions in the Nat Turner Rebellion and so on. I think it also will have been so I mean, and I suppose the other aspect is kind of its significance for anti-colonial revolutions. Toussaint has become a universal figure, for an inspirational figure, and the Haitian Revolution is kind of a model for anti-colonial revolutions. And this is one of the things that's dwelled on in the Black Jacobins. C.L.R. James is writing in 1938, looking forward to successful anti-colonial revolutions. And in a lot of senses, Toussaint and the Haitian Revolution established a kind of banner or a mantle that was inherited in the 20th century by revolutionaries from kind of Vietnam to Cuba. And actually, I think who was it? Maybe James himself actually compares Toussaint to like an 18th, 19th century Castro. So I mean, it had a significant impact in terms of abolition struggles at the time, in terms of the consciousness of enslaved people at the time, who became aware of the possibility for their own self-liberation. and that tradition carried on through the Nat Turner Rebellion, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in the 1850s, but also in the longer term in terms of anti-colonial and independence struggles in the 20th century. So it's massively significant and inspirational, both then and more recently.
Right. Thank you. I think we're going to move on to our last question now. Apologies if I haven't answered a couple of the questions that are left, but we're just running out of time a little bit. So someone has asked, let me find it. What do you think are the most important lessons we can learn as Marxists from the Haitian Revolution, especially in modern times? I think I would like to just quickly address this one before you move on to it, Owen. I think that one of the lessons that one of the sort of generalizations that we can learn about the Haitian Revolution, or more particularly what happened afterwards in terms of France saddling the country with debt, and the impact of American sanctions and stuff directly after the revolution, sort of shows that the Haitian bourgeois unfortunately came onto the scene of history too late, almost to play an independent role, as opposed to the bourgeois of countries like France and England, who had their bourgeois revolutions. Particularly England, who had their bourgeois revolution, a century or more before that. And the Haitian bourgeois couldn't really compete with these imperialist powers, and I think that what it really shows is that even today, only the working class can play a progressive role in Haitian society. There's no way that any sort of bourgeois movement in Haiti could play a progressive or anti-imperialist role. I think this is something that's vindicated also by the Cuban Revolution as well, which we discussed last week. And it obviously highlights the need for socialism to overcome imperialist oppression. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Owen.
Yeah, to me, I would kind of re-emphasize the point I made right at the end of the lead-off, I think, which was about kind of, as you say, the fact that you couldn't have possibly asked for any greater sacrifices from the Haitian people to win freedom, and yet, and that should be a constant source of inspiration for us. And yet, the end point, the only extent to which they could win freedom, was, of course, to abolish chattel slavery, and was to win national independence, which are massive gains. But it wasn't to abolish the plantation economy. It wasn't even to get rid of the white planters who ran that economy. It wasn't to overthrow an international system of imperialism and colonial domination. And it wasn't even to permanently erase race prejudice. And so there were massive gains. There were massive struggles that were left still to be completed at the end of the revolution, even after all these huge sacrifices. And I think that aside from the material circumstances which limited the scope of the Haitian Revolution, the revolution was always bound up with the fate of revolutions in the developed world, and in particular in the most powerful imperialist nations, and as we've been talking quite a lot about the UN and the role of American and French imperialism. The fact is that the Haitian Revolution, the spirit of the Haitian Revolution is still very much alive amongst the people. But it struggles to birth any new kind of society, not just because they lack a leadership there, but because no revolutionary leadership exists that's strong enough to prevent the intervention of imperialist nations, of imperialist states, so in the US and France. If you had a strong and independent working class organization with a revolutionary policy and with a consistent socialist policy, in any of these major imperialist countries, the freedom of people in places like Haiti, across the world, would to achieve their own revolutions, to achieve their own liberation, is massively expanded. And so I think in a lot of respects, that whenever we study a colonial revolution, there are all kinds of factors inside that society and inside that's sort of interior to that society that limits its revolutionary development or limits the development of the revolution. But in a lot of cases, it also depends massively on external factors that we actually have a lot of control over, and that place an imperative before us of building the strongest possible revolutionary organization where we're at. And so I'd encourage people to think about what they're doing to build that revolutionary organization in Britain, what kind of organization that should be. And I would implore people actually that organization is represented in the first instance by the Marxist Student Federation, but that federation is just a sort of subsidiary or a wing of the international Marxist tendency, which unites the struggle of students with the struggle of workers in Britain and with the struggle of workers and students across the world.
Thank you for that, Owen. You took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to plug the Marxist Student Federation there, but you did my job for me, so great. So yeah, that'll be the end of our discussion. Thank you very much, Owen, for leading it, and thank you for everyone who attended as well.
Thanks for having us, Jack.
Yeah, and as I no problem. And as I mentioned, this is part of a revolution series. So you've got more in store next week. I believe we're discussing China and the 1949 Chinese Revolution. So that should be really good. Make sure you check our social media for that. Our Facebook is Marxist Student Federation, and I believe our Twitter handle is @MarxistStudent. And as Owen mentioned, the Marxist Student Federation was set up and is linked to the international Marxist tendency. We've covered in this discussion the importance of internationalism in revolutionary movements. If you'd like to get involved in an international revolutionary organization, why not consider joining the IMT? The IMT is organizing in Britain as Socialist Appeal. So if you want to check out that website, is socialist.net. You can subscribe to our paper and learn about all the latest Marxist news and analysis. And yeah, I believe that's it. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks everyone on the live stream for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye.